because let's see. I love that I get to actually introduce these topics to you in this class. You'll talk about these in other parts of horticultural classes as well. All right, so the main components are air, water, minerals, and organic matter. And soil is basically separated into these different categories, just like we separate a lot of different things to, categorize and place into lists, one of which is soil structure. And soil structure, the ideal soil structure is, for horticulture, is granular. And the reason for it is because there are macropores and micropores that allow for air and water. We have already talked about the concept of soil texture, and the book covers this a little bit. You guys remember the components or the three parts of soil texture? Yes, exactly. Sand, silt, and clay. And you put them in order of largest to smallest particle size. So the sand is the largest particle size, clay is the smallest, and silt's in between. And let's see, what else do we want to say about these two? So sand has, or these three I should say. So sand is, the book calls it that it is not chemically reactive. What does that mean? That it means it does not have what we abbreviate as CEC, and that it stands for cation exchange capacity. At this point, it would be good to understand that cation exchange capacity is simply the ability of the soil to retain nutrients and make those available to the plant. So this is all about nutrient availability. So sand does not have this, however, clay has the highest CEC. And then silt is in the middle again. The other parts of soil texture that you would be able, or other things that you could determine from soil texture would be water holding capacity. And any ideas on which of these three would have the highest water holding capacity?
Clay.
Exactly. Water holding capacity, yeah, it's abbreviated WHC. So again, clay has the highest water holding capacity, which can be good or bad, right? So there's advantages and disadvantages to the sand and the clay. Yes?
I thought like plant life can really grow in clay though. Like it's like in the lake, like I feel it sometimes like when I'm swimming around if I dig deeper, but nothing's like growing in there.
Right, so if your soil is entirely clay, like if you, or even largely clay, because clay is such a small particle, the ideal soil texture, so this is our ideal structure, the ideal soil texture is referred to as loam. And loam has 20% clay, 40% silt, and 40% sand. The reason that there's less clay is because it is a smaller particle. So if you were to have, let's just say, 50% clay or higher, you may see some real issues with growing your plants. And that's because imagine having, this is a good example, even though this is obviously not what we're talking about, but the idea here is, hi Allie, come in. We're talking about soil. So you want to grab a seat there. so if you look at something like this, let's just pretend this is a giant size, or we're taking our microscope and looking at sand, okay? Right, obviously it's gravel. But you can see that there's all of these pockets for some air and some water. Obviously sand is gonna have a very quick drainage. But now if you were to imagine this were clay particles and strictly clay particles, they would be so tiny that they would compact very easily. Water's not gonna infiltrate very well. There's no air space. So for all those reasons, you don't wanna have a majority of clay, but having some clay is good. So there's benefits to all three. Silt is like the most fertile, but again, you wouldn't want to necessarily have all silt. So that is your ideal soil texture, is having that kind of combination. You're not going to find loam very often. If you do, then stay there forever and pass it down to your kids and your grandkids and people you like anyway, even if you don't have kids. So it's a very uncommon thing to find in our neck of the woods, essentially. Doesn't mean it's impossible though. So we did a jar test and we looked at, so I had the soils class doing a bunch of jar tests essentially, because we looked at several different types of soil. But when this jar test, and we kind of illustrated how to do that, you can see the differences. Essentially, you can pass this around really slowly, but what happens is the sand settles out first, and then generally you've got a layer of silt, and then your layer of clay is very thin, and then this upper portion is organic matter. Ideally, you would sift the organic matter out. So in order to get that kind of test, and in order to do a lot of the tests we do in soils, you remove the organic matter and send it through a 2 millimeter sieve. So you are removing all those larger particles, and as we know here, we have a lot of rocks and gravel in our soil as well. But in order to get that soil texture, this is one way to do it. This is just called the soil texture analysis jar test. It is a real thing. I didn't make it up. And then you would follow the percentages to find your texture of your soil. And that's going to give you a few things. There's other ways you can do it though, to be honest. If you start to, just like you said, when you're swimming and you can feel the clay, or if you're feeling a soil and you can feel that it's gritty and you know that there's some sand in it, there are ways to kind of determine what our soils are in other ways. Another test you can do, and this is again a real live test, I didn't make it up, it's called the ribbon test. There's a short 2-minute video of a soil scientist that's doing the ribbon test, and it is a matter of taking your soil, making a ball, forming ribbons, measuring the ribbons, following like a little bit of a flow chart to determine what your soils are. If you really want to know precisely, you'd send your soil out for a soil analysis, and you would ask for a particle test. They don't all give particle tests. If you don't ask for it, you're probably not going to get it. So you'll get your, nitrogen, phosphorus, all of those good things. Well, you may not get nitrogen because it's super mobile, but you'll get all of your analysis. You will not get particle if you don't ask. So what's the other big piece of this that the book touches on for about a chapter, I think? About a paragraph. Any thoughts on what else is involved here? Any thoughts? None? Really? None really? The soil food web. So it touches on this a little bit. So the reason I shared this is because this is put together by a Dr. Elaine Ingham. Soil Food Web is the name of her business. She also has a consulting operation. Ingham. Dr. Elaine Ingham. So she started doing this kind of early on. She's one of our earlier I don't want to say pioneers exactly, because I'm sure there are people back in the day who were doing this and understanding this, and some people understand it intuitively even. But at any rate, she was the one that was starting to put it to light a little bit earlier than most. There's a lot of people in our industry that now discuss the soil food web and how important it is. We talked on Monday about those 14 essential nutrients that we provide, right, as growers. We're now coming to an understanding that if we cultivate and steward the land and to have the best soil food web possible, we don't need the nutrients. And does anybody have trouble with that concept? Does that sound difficult to believe? It's okay if it does. It's okay if it doesn't. Does it sound believable? That we could avoid all these nutrients if we just had a happy soil food web? Yeah? I'm glad you're saying yeah. It took me a long time to say yeah to that. I'll be honest. I have never believed that until more recently. I thought that was a bunch of, BS. There's no way. I like my fertilizers. I use organic fertilizers. Doesn't matter if it's organic or not organic. But the truth is what we're finding is in some nutrients, if we are providing it to the plant, then the plant no longer is feeding the soil food web, so therefore those members of the soil food web are dying. They don't have anything to consume. So it's kind of like, what's a good analogy? It's kind of like if somebody's cooking for you all the time and you get a meal made for you every day of the week and every meal of the day, would you go cook? I wouldn't cook, right? So that's what's happening is the plant is getting everything fed to them on a silver platter with no need to do any work. So then the soil food web, everything that's happening down here, is not happening like it normally would without our inputs. So to me, it's a really big concept. I didn't, like I said, it's taken me up until the recent years to actually believe this, and I probably only really fully believe it this year. And the reason for it is because it's really out there. The research is really showing us this truth.
So it's saying you don't have to use a fertilizer. You could just rely on that to keep your soil well.
Yeah.
So how do you nurture that environment? Or like, because I'm assuming not every environment would be like that. Otherwise, we wouldn't need fertilizers.
Right.
So how would you nurture that?
Yeah, great question. That's a great question. And the truth is, here's the other truth to it. You're not going to get there automatically. Like, it's not going to happen next year even. So if a grower has been, and even in, many cases, even in organic cases, it don't matter if it's a organic farm or not organic farm or whatever, or even a permaculture farm. I've talked about that, or a regenerative farm. It's going to take time to get to that place. And you may still do a maintenance program on some nutrients, like let's say just for instance nitrogen, because it's needed in the highest quantity. But how can you nurture that? That's a great question. So the best way to nurture this in this environment is to do the complete opposite of what was experienced in 1930 with the Dust Bowl, and that is to always have ground cover. Because what happens is, if you've always got ground cover, so this is going to be cover crops as your ideal. So that's going to be your ideal, or cash crops, obviously. You can always have cash crops. Cash crops? No, you don't want cash crops. You want cash crops. We don't want any crap here. Well, unless it's good manure. But if you have cover on your land, then the roots, these are my terrible looking roots, but at any rate, the roots are always going to be exuding what we call exudates. And those exudates are producing the absolutely key pieces to attract these critters. And what's amazing about it, in my opinion, is that the plants are exuding the type of sugars that attract the exact ones that they want. So it's like the plant is aware of what it needs. It's really brilliant in that situation. But other ways that you can nurture this is, I mean, really cover crops and cash crops, having plant on the land is the most beneficial. And so other things that we're learning about are just having diversity. So like in our cropping systems, and this is why, we'll talk about this when we get out there, but this is why I'm thinking when I ran up there and back, it's good for me to run away and come back, it makes me think. Showers work too, but at any rate, I feel like we're gonna plant in the rye, and part of the reason I was thinking let's plant in the rye is because it's gonna be the warmest. But now I'm thinking, you know what? There's 2 other crops in those beds. So we have rye, winter rye, and Alice white clover. And now we're gonna plant garlic. So winter rye, which is different. So there's 3 different types of vegetation in there. There's 3 different families, right? This is poa. This is a legume, or a grass, let's just call it grass.
Aren't legumes really good for fixing nitrogen?
Yep, legumes are awesome for that, although it's the bacteria that does the work. And then garlic is allium. So these are 3 different plant categories, and what we're finding is if you can introduce more plant categories, then there becomes even a more lively food web. But then there becomes these practical questions. Like I love the practical questions because that's where I stand up and say, well, I don't understand how to work with this system. Like if I got all these cover, or this plant cover, how do I actually plant my crop, right? Or my vegetables, you know, this doesn't quite make sense. So there are still some pieces of it that we're trying to work through, like how do we coincide with these 4, you know, or more. I mean, some people are saying you should have like 16 different crops out there. There's cover crop recipes, I guess we could call them, that have up to 21 different crops in them. That's incredible. I mean, we've gotten away from this whole monoculture piece in such a big way that it's kind of blowing my mind because that's a lot. Yeah.
So I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
So why, or I mean, I don't know, why would you do this instead of fertilizing? Or why would you fertilize instead of doing that? Is that because it's cheaper or one's better for the environment? Like, why find another way if the other one was working well?
Good question. So good question. So 2 reasons for that, and one is